Hello, fourth graders. So this week in social studies, you've been learning a little bit about the Civil War, a little bit about slavery, about the North and the South, and what was happening during that time. So I chose to read a book today called Henry's Freedom Box. This is a true story from the Underground Railroad. We haven't learned too much about the Underground Railroad yet, but the week after we will. Um, there were abolitionists who wanted to get rid of slavery, and there were some very amazing people who tried to free the slaves and get them to a safer place into freedom. Okay, and one of the ways that that was done was through the Underground Railroad. So this is Henry's story, and it's written by, oh, and it's covered up on that side. So this is written by Ellen Levine or Levine and illustrated by Kadir Nelson. So this is called Henry's Freedom Box. So listen carefully because you're going to have to answer some questions, but I also want you to just enjoy. Okay, so I want you to kind of put yourself in Henry's position as a child and thinking about what it was like to be a slave during that time and not have any rights at all, okay, and not the best conditions to be living in. So Henry's Freedom Box. Henry Brown wasn't sure how old he was. Henry was a slave, and slaves weren't allowed to know their birthdays. Henry and his brothers and sisters worked in the big house where the master lived. Henry's master had been good to Henry and his family, but Henry's mother knew things could change. Do you see those leaves blowing in the wind? They are torn from the trees like slave children are torn from their families, because a lot of times the children were taken away from their families. Okay. One morning, the master called for Henry and his mother. They climbed the wide staircase. The master lay in bed with only his head above the quilt. He was very ill. He beckoned for them to come closer. Some slaves were freed by their owners. Henry's heart beat fast. Maybe the master would set them free. But the master said, "You are a good worker, Henry. I am giving you to my son. You must obey him and never tell a lie." Henry nodded, but he didn't say thank you. That would have been a lie. So he wasn't being set free. He was being sold to his son. Later that day, Henry watched a bird soar high above the trees. Free bird, happy bird, Henry thought. Henry said goodbye to his family. He looked across the field. The leaves swirled in the wind. So he was being taken away from his family and had to go work for someone else. Can you imagine how that would feel? Henry worked in the new master's factory. He was good at his job. "Do not tear that tobacco leaf," the boss yelled at the new boy. He poked the boy with a stick. If you made a mistake, the boss would beat you. And friends, these are true stories, so this is based on true events. Okay, so he had to go work at the tobacco factory. You know how normally with a job you get paid? These slaves did not get paid and they were not treated well. Henry was lonely. One day he met Nancy, who was shopping for her mistress. They walked and talked and agreed to meet again. Henry felt like singing, but slaves didn't dare sing in the streets. Instead, he hummed all the way home. So he met someone that he could relate to. Months later, Henry asked Nancy to be his wife. When both their masters agreed, Henry and Nancy were married. Soon there was a little baby, then another and another. Henry knew they were very lucky. They lived together even though they had different masters. But Nancy was worried. Her master had lost a great deal of money. I'm afraid he will sell our children," she said. Henry sat very still. Henry worked hard all morning. He tried to forget what Nancy had said. So now he's a grown man with his own children, and that fear is coming back. His friend James came into the factory. He whispered to Henry, "Your wife and children were just sold at the slave market." "No!" cried Henry. Henry couldn't move. He couldn't think, and he couldn't work. "Twist that tobacco," the boss poked Henry. Henry twisted tobacco leaves. His heart twisted in his chest. So he had lost his wife and his children. They were sold. I know it's hard for you to understand that human beings could be sold as property, but that's what happened during that time, during the conflict between the North and the South. At lunchtime, Henry rushed to the center of town. A large group of slaves were tied together. The owner shouted at them, "Father, father!" Henry watched his children disappear down the road. Where was Nancy? He saw her the same moment she saw him. When he wiped away his tears, Nancy was gone too. So in the blink of an eye, he had lost his whole family. Henry no longer sang. He didn't hum. He went to work, and at night he ate supper and went to bed. Henry tried to think of happy times, but all he could see were the carts carrying away everyone he loved. Henry knew he would never see his family again. Many weeks passed. One morning, Henry heard singing. A little bird flew out of a tree and into the open sky, and Henry thought about being free. But how? As he lifted a crate, he knew the answer. He asked James and Dr. Smith to help him. Dr. Smith was a white man who thought slavery was wrong. They met early the next day at an empty warehouse. Henry arrived with a box. "I will mail myself to a place where there are no slaves," he said. James stared at the box, then at Henry. "What if you cough and someone hears you?" "I will cover my mouth and hope." So, Henry is going to put himself in that box, and then that box is going to be transported to the north, like it would have goods in it. Okay. Dr. Smith wrote on the box, "To William H. Johnson, Arch Street, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania." Henry would be delivered to a friend's in Philadelphia. Then he printed on the crate in big letters, "This side up with care." It's a big risk he's taking, right? Henry needed an excuse to stay home, or the work boss would think he had run off. James pointed to Henry's sore finger, but Henry knew it wasn't bad enough. He opened a bottle of oil of vitriol. "No!" cried James. Henry poured it on his hand. It burned his skin to the bone. Now the boss would have to let him stay home. Dr. Smith bandaged Henry's hand. They arranged to meet the next morning at 4 o'clock. This is all in secret, okay? The sun was not up yet when Henry climbed into the box. "Ready?" he said. James nailed down the lid. Dr. Smith and James drove to the station. The railway clerk tipped the box over and nailed a paper to the bottom. Dr. Smith begged the clerks to be careful, but they didn't listen. They threw the box into the baggage car. Imagine if that was you in there and what that would feel like. Hours passed. Henry was lifted up and thrown again. Upside down. He heard waves splashing. This must be the steamboat, headed for Washington, D.C. The ship rode smoothly, but Henry was still upside down. Blood rushed to his head. His face got hot. His eyes ached. He thought his head would burst, but he was afraid to move. Someone might hear him. Imagine how that would feel, how uncomfortable that would be. But that was the risk he was taking, right? "I'm tired of standing," someone said. "Why don't we move that box and sit on it?" said another. Henry held his breath. Could they be talking about his box? Henry was pushed. The box scraped the deck. Now he was on his right side, now on his left, and suddenly right side up. You're going to have to describe later what his journey was like in the box. "What do you think is in there?" said the first man. "Mail, I guess," said the other. "I am mail," thought Henry, "but not the kind they imagine." Henry was carried off the steamboat and placed in a railroad car, this time heads up. He fell asleep to the rattling song of the train wheels. He awoke to loud knocking. "Henry, are you all right in there?" "All right," he answered. The cover was pried open. Henry stretched and stood up. 4 men smiled at him. "Welcome to Philadelphia." Remember, that's part of the Union in the North. At last, Henry had a birthday, March 30th, 1849, his first day of freedom. That's my birthday, friends, March 30th. So, once again, March 30th, 1849. And from that day on, he also had a middle name. Everyone called him Henry Box Brown. And That is the story of Henry's Freedom Box. So, what's really neat is in the back, in the author's note, it gives you a little bit of information about what it was like during that time. In the mid 1800s, there were about 4 million slaves living in the United States. Slaves were owned like tables or cows or wagons. Historians believed between 60,000 and 100,000 slaves escaped to freedom, traveling on what was called the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad wasn't a real railroad. It was all the secret ways slaves made their way from the South to the North. They hid in carts, rode on horseback, walked hundreds of miles through forests and swamps, and crossed flowing rivers in summer and icebound rivers in winter. Conductors and station masters hid them and helped them throughout their journey. When Henry Brown climbed into his freedom box, he hoped he'd be carried to a safe world. He brought along a small tool to make air holes, like a little water and a few biscuits. So he had traveled 350 miles from Virginia, where he was, in 27 hours. His story made newspaper headlines in America and Europe. Henry never did find Nancy and his children. In 1850, he went to England, and there were some reports that he married again. We do know with absolute certainty that Henry Box Brown became one of the most famous runaway slaves on the Underground Railroad, the man who mailed himself to freedom. So that's a pretty inspiring story. I have a lot of feelings when I listen to this book, and I can't imagine what it would have been like in the 1800s, like in the 1850s, around that time. So hopefully you enjoyed this, and you might need to come back to my video to answer some of the questions. Maybe, maybe not. So hopefully you enjoyed that.